Hi everyone, and welcome to the first of the Locke readings. We're going to be doing this one a little bit differently. Locke generously breaks his text up into different sections, and so we'll basically be following those sections. I'll try and do sort of a few in each video. Otherwise, we'll end up with 10 videos on Locke, all of them a couple of minutes each. But yeah. You'll see with the slides coming up that I've tried to structure the slides around each of the sections of the reading. This first video is going to cover sections 8 through to 11. Remember, the topic is personal identity, and as an overall point, Locke certainly views personal identity as being it is our consciousness. Your personal identity, yourself is within your mind, not necessarily suggesting any non-physical element, but your conscious mind is where you are, not necessarily in the body that the mind is within. Locke is an empiricist, but he's not an empiricist at the same level that that David Hume is. So if you've watched the David Hume videos, I talk about him being what I like to call a skeptical empiricist, or sort of an extreme empiricist, where he will not make any conclusion that there isn't evidence for, to the point where he will not identify patterns and suggest that they have any power of prediction in the future. So, cause and effect doesn't really exist. When it comes to self, he argues that there is no self because there's nothing that continues. Locke disagrees with this. Being an empiricist, he still bases his argument on evidence and what he has direct evidence of. But he argues that our consciousness actually does give us direct evidence of something that lasts a while. And he'll be using memory as the main kind of weapon in his arsenal to try and prove that. So to start off on the reading, we'll start with section 8. So in this section, we only read a part of it, just to be clear, but Locke explains, he sort of gives us a few definitions for animal firstly, and then man, and how we identify those in others. Okay, so this is really sort of a third person idea. So if I'm identifying you, what's the way that I do that? And what Locke is going to say is, we identify people by the way we identify things rather by the way they look. So we'll see a dog as a dog if it looks like a dog, and a person as a person if it looks like a person. But as we'll see soon enough in the next section, that designation of person, he thinks, should be more particular. So let's start it off. So pens and highlighters at the ready. I'm going from 8, same man. So in our reader books, it's the bottom right hand side of the very first page of the Locke reading. Okay, so number 8, or part 8, same man. An animal is a living organized body, and consequently the same animal, as we have observed, is the same continued life communicated to different particles of matter as they happen successively to be united in that organized living body. So very first sentence here, though it's a long one, Locke identifies what he sees as being an animal. It is a living organized body, and the thing that connects that living organized body across, the changes of the particles of that body is that continuation of life. Okay, so for Locke, your dog is still your dog, despite the fact that some of the particles within it may have changed while you were out today. How do you recognize it as your dog? Well, it's had that continuation of life. And that sort of knitted together all of the particles within it to create the one continued life form. Okay, so this is what an animal is, a living organized body with a continuation of life communicated to the different particles. Continuing on, and whatever is talked of other definitions, ingenious observations put it past doubt that the idea in our minds, of which the sound man in our mouths is the sign, is nothing else but of an animal of such a certain form. Okay, so what Locke is suggesting here is that we are not so different from the animals around us. So he's talking particularly of humans here, or of man, um, and he's sort of saying, despite what other people may say, and maybe with a little bit of value in their argument, we really can't identify ourselves as anything beyond just a particular type of animal. Um, and when he says that the idea of our minds, of which the sound man in our mouths is the sign, is nothing but that of an animal of such a certain form. Even though we speak, that doesn't um, prove much beyond the fact that we are what we are. We certainly are different to other animals, but we're not different to the point of actually existing in a different way, if that makes sense. Okay, so our physical self, and remember, Locke is sort of talking about third person identity here. So when we look at others, um, when someone is speaking to you and they're in the form of a person, or a human, I should say, that's what you identify them as. Uh, this next part should clarify that point a little bit more. So, since I think I may be confident that whoever should see a creature of his own shape or make, though it had no more reason all its life than a cat or a parrot, would call him still a man. So, what Locke is saying here is, if you see a person, although that person may lack a certain level of mental processing. And Locke is talking about reasoning here. So though that person may not understand the world around them, you know, because they inhibit the physical form of a man, as in mankind here, then that's what we identify them as. And we'll see the flip side of this coin now. Or whoever should hear a cat or a parrot discourse, reason, and philosophize would call or think it nothing but a cat or a parrot, and say the one was a dull, irrational man, and the other a very intelligent, rational parrot. So what Locke is really saying here is, when we're identifying others, we identify them based on what they look like. I will see a human and perceive that to be a human, and if I enter into discussion with it and that human, and find that it is unintelligent, that it cannot speak, it cannot string a sentence together, that wouldn't lead me to think that it is something other than a human. And if by chance I ever came across a cat and the cat started speaking to me, and I carried on a philosophical conversation with a cat, first thing I'd do is probably check the dosage on my medication. But uh, the thing that I certainly wouldn't do is then say that that cat is now not a cat. Well, it looks like a cat. It may not sound like a cat, but it certainly looks like one. And so this is the way that we identify the things around us, in that third person way. So a relation we have in an author of great note is sufficient to countenance the supposition of a rational parrot. We then get this very strange story about a possessed parrot in Brazil, with sections that are written in Portuguese. To be honest with you, it's not actually part of our reading. It's just weird. Feel free to have a laugh and read it, but I'm not going to go through it now. So that was section 8. Really, we've got the definition for an animal and for man or mankind. Like Locke is using this in the the overall sense, not the gender-specific sense. Okay, so an animal is an organized body with a continuation of life. Man is an organized structure in the form of a human. Okay, and reason alone does not make us think that that organized structure is different. So this is the third person account. Okay, so moving on to section 9 now. This is where Locke will start to use the word person quite purposefully. Okay, so he is going to identify a person as a thinking, intelligent being. This will lead him to talking about thinking and consciousness, which he sees as being um, necessarily connected. And when we say necessarily in philosophy, what we're talking about there is that if something is necessarily linked, you can't have one without the other. Okay, and so for Locke, thought is always present with consciousness, and consciousness is always present with thought. They are inherently or necessarily linked. Okay. Um, Locke then points out that our consciousness is linked with our past self via our memories. Okay, and so this is now where we're starting to get a continuation of a perceived first person self. Okay, so how we see ourselves. So personal identity. This being premised, to find wherein personal identity consists, we must consider what person stands for, which, and here comes a definition from Locke, which I think is a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself, the same thinking thing in different times and places, which it does only by that consciousness which is inseparable from thinking, and, as it seems to me, essential to it, it being impossible for any one to perceive without perceiving that he does perceive. So again, a nice long sentence to start off the next section from Locke, but we get a clear indication of how Locke is separating a person from a man. A man is the physical form of a human. A person is this intelligent being which is possessed of consciousness and is linked to the past via memories and has a perception of themselves as themselves. Okay. And so, really, what Locke is identifying as a person is something which consists of consciousness. The difficulty with this, obviously, is that we're only ever aware of our own consciousness. And so, the first person account, I can look at you and say that you are a human. I can't look at you or talk to you and know that you are a person because, well, I'm not aware of whether you're conscious or not. Only you're ever aware of that. You mimic consciousness and it looks like you're conscious, and I'd probably be fair to treat you as if you are conscious, as if you have a knowledge of self, and as if you are an intelligent being. But I can't actually know that. So this is one of the big things with Locke's personal identity. Okay. So continuing on, when we see, hear, smell, taste, feel, meditate, or will anything, we know that we do so. Thus it is always as to our present sensations and perceptions, and by this every one is to himself that which he calls self. It not being considered in this case whether the same self be continued in the same or diverse substances. Um, For since consciousness always accompanies thinking, and it is that which makes every one to be what he calls self, and thereby distinguishes himself from all other thinking things, in this alone consists personal identity, i.e., the sameness of a rational being. I'll pause there for a moment. We've covered a big chunk there, but really, what Locke starts off as saying is anytime where we see, hear, smell, taste, feel, meditate, or will, we're aware of ourselves doing that. We know that we're doing it. And so that knowledge of us doing it is our consciousness, according to Locke. Okay. Locke then says that this consciousness is always accompanied by thinking. As I said before, thinking and consciousness go hand in hand. They must occur simultaneously. And, Locke very clearly states here, in this alone consists personal identity. So for Locke, this is where you exist. So to continue on, so i.e. the sameness of a rational being, and as far as this consciousness can be extended backwards to any past action or thought, so far reaches the identity of that person. So if you're wondering, well, and remember, Locke is using the word person here quite purposefully. So am I the same person as I was, when I had my 5th birthday? Well, for Locke, if you can remember it, then yes, because your consciousness can then reach back to that point. So you are that person. Um, can I am I the same person as I was when I was born? For Locke, if you have no memory of being born, then no, you are not the same person. You're the same human because you've got this, an organized body with a continuation of life successively being passed on from particle to particle as they change. You're the same human, or man, but you're not the same person. Okay, so person is reliant on consciousness. Um, it is the same self now. Uh, it is the same self now it was then, and it is by the same self with this present one that now reflects on it that this action was done. So, if you're wondering, well, who blew out the candles at your fifth birthday or my fifth birthday? Well, I did, if I remember doing it. So any past actions that pop up, this is going to be important later. Any past actions that I take, um, if I want to know if I did them or not, if I remember doing them, then I, as in the person my consciousness, did do them. If I don't remember, then it wasn't me. It may have been my human form, okay? It may have been like me as a man, but it wasn't my person or my consciousness. Okay, it wasn't actually me. Remember, self is consciousness. The way we identify ourselves as ourselves is consciousness. So it may have been my body, but it wasn't me. I wasn't there. My person wasn't there. Okay. Um, all right. Section 10, Locke's going to expand on this idea of consciousness being the form of identity, and he's going to expand on on the issue of, well, what happens when our physical form changes, or our substance changes. So what happens when the physical man changes? And what Locke is going to conclude is that, well, self or identity follows the consciousness. Okay, it's just that simple. Consciousness is self. There's no two ways about it for Locke. Okay, so 10, consciousness makes personal identity, but it is further inquired whether it be the same identical substance. So remember, here with substance, Locke is talking about our physical form. This few would think they had reason to doubt of, if these perceptions with their consciousness always remained present in the mind, whereby the same thinking thing would be always consciously present, and, as would be thought, evidently the same to itself. Uh, but that which seems to make the difficulty is this, that this consciousness being interrupted always by forgetfulness, there being no moment of our lives wherein we have the whole train of all our past actions before our eyes in one view, but even the best memories losing the sight of one past whilst they are viewing another, and we sometimes, and that the greatest part of our lives, not reflecting on our past selves, being intent on our present thoughts, and in sound sleep having no thoughts at all, or at least none with that consciousness which remarks our waking thoughts. So really the king of long sentences here, Locke. Um, it's gone on for a while. Let's track back a little bit. The common question that people have is, well, you know, isn't is the separation of substance and consciousness really necessary? Because surely my consciousness has been present in my physical, like my body, my human form. Um, and so if my consciousness is always present in my human form, then isn't it, aren't they one in the same? Like, why are we separating self away from our physical substance? And what Locke says is, well, yeah, it might feel that way, but actually it's not. Your consciousness is constantly interrupted by forgetfulness. It might feel like you're taking in everything, but you're really not. If you're focused on the external world and looking at what you're doing, well, then you're not paying attention to the thoughts in your head. If you divert your attention to the thoughts in your head, then you're not going to be paying attention to the external world. We feel like we have this perfect perception of the world around us, but for Locke, you don't. It's just not the case. And so these interruptions mean that we can't see our consciousness as the same thing as our physical form, because they're not always linked. Sometimes our physical form is there, but not our consciousness, not the person. Um, And so Locke also then identifies sleep as something that causes one of these interruptions. We have no thoughts when we are sound asleep. And so Locke is pointing out there that, um, during sleep, then we obviously are not conscious. And so whilst our physical form is there, we are not. Um, Waking thoughts. I say, in all these cases, our consciousness being interrupted and we losing the sight of our past selves, doubts are raised whether we are the same thinking thing, i.e., the same substance, or no. Um, so he's saying, because of these interruptions, can we really say that you are the same person as was sleeping in your bed? If you have no memory of it, if you had no awareness of it, was it really you, or was it just your physical form, your human self? Okay. Which, however reasonable or unreasonable, concerns not present identity at all. The question being, what makes the same person, and not whether it be the same identical substance which always thinks in the same person, which in this case matters not at all. So here Locke is saying, well, if our substance changes, does that mean our self changes? Of course not. If you go and get a haircut, you don't come home and say, I'm a new person. You might, like, tongue in cheek say it, but you don't actually mean you're a new person. Why? Because a haircut doesn't change your consciousness. Okay. Um, uh, which in this case matters not at all. Sorry. Different substances by the same consciousness, where they do partake in it, being united into one person, as well as different bodies by the same life, are united into one animal, whose identity is preserved in that change of substance by the unity of one continued life. Um, so Locke is saying here, what makes a person the same is the continuation of consciousness. Okay, and let's say theoretically that my consciousness could pass on to someone else. Well, that would be me passing on into another body. Okay, um, the continuation of an animal is a bit different. Okay, it is the identity rather of an animal is a bit different. It's the continuation of life, uh, and life being, this continuation of life being passed from one set of particles to the next. Okay. For it being the same consciousness that makes a man be himself to himself, personal identity depends on that only, whether it be annexed solely to one individual substance or can be continued in a succession of several substances. So this is, to link back to Buddhism, potentially reincarnation. Could your person, be reincarnated to another body? Yes. And you would still be, like, if that's possible, then you would still be you, because self identity follows consciousness. So even if your consciousness inhabits another body, okay? um, for it is by the consciousness it has of its present thoughts and actions that it is self to itself now, and so will be the same self as far as the same consciousness can extend to actions past or to come, and would be by distance of time or change of substance no more two persons than a man be two men by wearing uh, other clothes today than he did yesterday, with a long or short sleep between. The same consciousness uniting those distant actions into the same person, whatever substances contributed to their production. So what Locke is pointing out here is that if we were going to identify self with substance, well, this is a tricky thing because it's not the way that we identify the world. Um, you know, identify ourselves rather. We don't see ourselves as being different when we have physical changes. We're not a different person, as Locke, suggest. He doesn't suggest. He's saying it would be no more. So he's using it as an extreme example. But we're not a different person when we change our clothes, and so because our consciousness hasn't changed, we need to have the same attitude to our substance, according to Locke. There might be changes, but where have you really changed? You, as in the way you perceive self? Not really. Your personal identity follows your consciousness. Okay. So continuing on, section 11. This is the last little section for this recording. And so let's kick it off. Number 11, personal identity and change of substances. So Locke here is going to be talking about the idea that our self survives physical changes, talking about whilst you might feel desperately connected to your arm and feel like it's an integral part of yourself, if the worst should happen and your arm one day gets amputated, what you would find is that you still perceive yourself as yourself. And why? Because we didn't amputate your consciousness. The arm that was so precious to your identity actually isn't precious to your identity at all. You have changed physically, no doubt, and Locke's not denying that, but yourself has not changed. So personal identity and change of substances. That this is so, we have some kind of evidence in our very bodies, all whose particles, whilst vitally united in the same thinking conscious self, so that we feel when we are touched and are affected by the conscious of good or harm that happens to them, are a part of ourselves, i.e., of our thinking conscious self. Thus the limbs of his body are to every one a part of himself. He sympathizes and is concerned for them. Cut off a hand and thereby separate it from that consciousness he had of its heat, cold, and other affections, that it is then no longer a part of that which is himself, any more than the remotest part of matter. So I know that I've read a big section there, but I was just wanting to get to this point. So Locke is basically saying here what I said before. You might feel like your physical self is really important to your perception of self, and it is. It's important, but it's not critical. It's not necessary in the way that I was talking about it before. You perceive a whole bunch of things through your hands. You know, you could put it into warm water and feel the warmth, for example. But upon losing that, you haven't lost self. So the hand was never necessary for self. Okay. Thus we see the substance whereof personal self consisted at one time may be varied at another without the change of personal identity. So here Locke has outright said it. Our substance can change from one time to another, but we have no change of personal identity, assuming that our consciousness has continued. There being no question about the same person, though the limbs, which but now were part of it, be cut off. So we don't even question whether we are the same person or not. Was it your arm that got cut off? Should that happen to you? Damn right, you're going to say it was your arm that was cut off. And so for Locke, this is it. You know, we clearly perceive that we are the one self. Okay, as long as consciousness continues, change to our substance really is sort of inconsequential to identity of self. Okay, so we'll leave that one there. There'll probably be at least 2 more recordings for Locke based on the breakdown of the sections. Hopefully you found it helpful. Like and subscribe as always, and I'll see you in class.